What are ways teachers can support math literacy in their classrooms?
Oh wow. Yeah. So you may know, I'm a co-author on a book that focuses on social justice and mathematics. So I think literacy, um, you know, much of my work around math literacy probably is informed some by Bob Moses in his book Radical Equations, but I didn't become introduced to Bob Moses until I became an academic. I did, but I didn't have the language when I was a classroom teacher. So I would think I was always in this math literacy space and helping people make sense of how mathematics impacts their lives and how to use math to read and write the world and those kinds of things. Even when I describe having kids to make games, and then after you make the game that so that you can win every time. How can you, but I mean, there was some level of strategy and thinking about strategy in this case related to mathematics. So for me, math literacy is then how do we support people, not only children, students, but families, use mathematics to help them read and write the world. I think that was a significant part of my experience growing up, and I think it's a significant part of my experience as a teacher. And so one might turn to kind of things like, cooking and paying bills and things of that nature, but I think it's bigger than that. Really, I really do think it's bigger than that. In the sense that when you see things kind of in the local media, what does that mean? Yeah, and making sense, like number sense. Like I saw a representation today um, that showed, $10, $100, $1,000, and it built up to $1 trillion. And it showed, this kind of representation, how much $1 trillion is relative to these other sides, and having that relative number sense. Um, and so for me, you know, just trying to find those things that make sense. So I can give you one example. So so when I taught at an Achievable Dream, there was a local kind of, I guess the best way to describe it, a convenience store, but not really a convenience store, kind of, local store, right? Kind of died, right? It's so candy, things of that nature. Um, and And I can remember working with a group of students, and these students went in and told the store owner his sign is wrong, right? Because he had a handwritten sign, and I think they were selling candy. And I remember it had 20, it had the cent sign and 0.25. And the kids told him, your sign is wrong. It's like, it's 25 cents. Like, if it was 20, you don't need kids were trying to explain to him, you don't need the decimal if you have the cent sign. And through that conversation, just that, how these kids were trying to help this person, like, but also gave me an opportunity to talk to him, like, yeah, technically, mathematically, you're correct, but everybody know what that sign meant. So having that kind of conversation with kids as well. But yeah, you're right. But but mathematical literacy, I would say, is also kind of stepping into those spaces where we where we get to make decisions about the things that influence our lives. And so it is having a sense of, you know, being, teaching downtown Newport News and wondering all of the things that about housing and prices and things of that nature. Another example I give to you was I helped found a program called Math Men in Mission here in Charlottesville. And one of the things that we used to do is we would do things to mathematize our community. I did an example where we just kind of pulled tax records and just kind of going online and looking at tax records of homes in different communities throughout the city. And we were at, and I would ask, well, how come this house is worth this much? And how come this house is worth that much? And just kind of asking questions for them. And instinctively, many of them knew, you know why this one is worth more than that, because look at where it's at, right? I mean, so tell me more about what you mean by where it's at. I mean, because, even we're talking about, so they began to understand kind of location and the relationship between, you know, the value of homes in different communities. And so we began to then pull more data just to kind of understand that. And what we began to do, because I knew before we did this project, there used to be a Black community in Charlottesville called Vinegar Hill. Vinegar Hills no longer existed. What happened in the 60s and 70s, the community was bought out and it was bulldozed down. And now now in that location is a Staples, a McDonald's. Um, um, it just decimated this Black community, and they just put in these shopping centers and stores and things of that nature. But I was able to then connect our activity to the history of Charlottesville, because we then had this conversation. I think, what do you think they did to the cost of houses in Vinegar Hill before they bulldozed them down? How can someone go buy a whole community? And we're being speculative, but it's kind of raising those questions. I wonder if that's happening in other places, and having these kinds of conversations about, I because you got to imagine I'm working with seventh grade boys, so I'm saying, yeah, who can just go buy a whole community? I mean, so, and having that, and I'm like, there are places in the United States where people can buy whole communities, and if they can, you know, change the property rights to the area in which they purchase, they can then make that community what they want it to be. And then we're able to then connect it to gentrification. And so we had these interesting kinds of conversation based on looking at how much houses cost in which communities, and then how historically we can begin to track this back. We also did, you may have heard what happened in Charlottesville in 2017. One of the activities that we did was my boys did not too far from where we were doing MQ was the statue of Robert E. Lee, which no longer is there. But they were like, well, just go and just, because there were talks at the time just removing the statues. And that's what happened. The activities in 2017 was really around about that. And so they were like, why don't we just go and push it down? I'm like, let's get a sense of how big this thing is, right? Let's get a sense of how big this thing is. And so we use perfect, I wish I could claim that I planned for this. We did a proportional reasoning where the sun was just perfect. You can see the shadow of the statue. We were able to measure, and we used the Pythagorean theorem, just come up with an estimate of how tall Robert E. Lee was. And it turns out Robert E. Lee was, I think, 12 feet tall, right? So the question I asked, why did they make him 12 feet tall? Are there people walking around here that's 12 feet tall? Why was he 12 feet tall? And the boys, one of the boys like, oh, they want to make him bigger than life. Well, why would they make him bigger than life, right? Than a real person. I wonder how tall Robert E. Lee was in real life, right? It was just kind of those kinds of questions that connected the history of our community to kind of some level of mathematics. Mathematics was the entry point to have these conversations about the history of our community, about things that were occurring, events that were happening right then and there, that they had a sense about, and kind of develop a sense around. So the whole issue around Robert E. Lee, and when the statue came down, they were really like, that thing was big. I mean, it was big. I mean, so that question to the head, I said, not only was it big, but they had it on a very impressive pedestal. I mean, so it's all of those things. And so the question I began to ask, the story behind that, putting this figure on this pedestal, making him larger than life, that was intentional. And it feeds into the narrative about these people and who they are. And so me, it was a way of having this kind of conversation about race and the Confederacy in Virginia without jumping around and saying, he was a slaveholder, this and that, and the other. Like, no, the representation of something can be significantly important as well.
I love what you said too, with that the math was the entry point, because sometimes when we're thinking about activities like that, we think of using the history or trying to find some other connection, but you use the math for the entry point with that. And so I love that